You are listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Happy Tuesday evening. This is Scotty Roberts, and you're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. And that is ODYSY1.com, where you can go listen to the show audio only, and you can find all the different places where it broadcasts via either internet networks, iHeartRadio, places like that, or terrestrial stations. That'll tell you all of that over at Odyssey1.com, or you can come over and watch my simulcast video of this radio show over on my YouTube page. It's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. And I want you to know, folks, what I bring to the table with Star Trek is not anything I've studied in school or anything like that. All my other stuff, my historical stuff, my archaeological stuff, my psychological stuff, all of this is products of things that I've done either through my education or vocation, and I'm an artist on the side as well, but I'm a geek and a nerd. I grew up with all of this stuff, and so this is all stuff I've just gained by being a fan and a nerd boy and a geek boy my whole life. And, of course, I've wanted to take some of those things I found in Star Trek, and I think Star Trek goes a lot deeper than simply being science fiction for entertainment's sake, which, if we all admit it, that's what it really is. But in order to create good storylines, good arc, to have the longevity that Star Trek has had, you have to have not only those sci-fi and fictional elements that appeal to people on an imaginative, creative entertainment level, but you've got to have good writing that incorporates really good humanity, good psychology, all of those things into the characters to make them interesting. And that's why I started what I started yesterday with Mr. Spock. And it was trying to dig into and find out a little bit more about the character on a psychological level. And are those things that we can take and apply to ourselves when we watch a show like Star Trek? Can we find that Star Trek, while being entertainment, is also something that bears with it a psychological element and teaches lessons? We all know, we mentioned this yesterday, the original Star Trek, it's become cliche if you're a fan of Star Trek, that the original was a series of little morality plays. Now, not every episode accomplished that, some more poorly than others, but they were morality plays put together and things that dealt with things in current society of the late 1960s put into a science fiction television show. I mean, things from, you look at the interracial bridge crew. That was pretty unique in television in the mid to late 1960s. The civil rights movement happened smack in the middle of Star Trek's run, and toward the end, toward its demise on television. And so, looking at these characters from a different point of view, we get a little better understanding of them and maybe a better understanding of who we are as people. We looked at Spock yesterday and started to talk about the elements of Spock's character. He was a child of two worlds. In the original storyline, he had the conflict of having parents that were not just interracial but interplanetary, totally different races. But of course, this common human bond beneath, as they develop differently in different parts of the galaxy. And this produced Spock, and so he grew up with this emotional conflict within himself, having to choose. He's half human, which strengthened his emotional makeup. He had his Vulcan, which The training, really, in Vulcan to eschew emotion was something that went against their natural, as it was brought up in the storyline, the very deeply emotional race. But their limbic system was something that made them be faster thinkers. And so they applied all of these things to overcoming emotion. As we know, Spock at one point had gone through the Colinar, which was to eschew all emotion altogether. This doesn't mean they didn't have emotion. It meant that they chose to get rid of it because they saw it as illogical, as something that was not befitting their society, something that caused more problems than not. And yet we see a character like Spock, who is half human, constantly struggling with this in the original series. Now that morphed and changed and evolved over the years with the older Leonard Nimoy, the older Spock in the later movies. They dealt with those issues in a different way. We found out how much more emotionally Vulcans really were. And then, of course, we had the J.J. Abrams universe, love it or hate it, that was introduced into the Star Trek canon, if you will. It was not canon up to that point. They had to change canon in order to accomplish the things they wanted to accomplish with the story. And the characters reflected that. And Spock is one of those most enduring characters from Star Trek because we saw him coming from one thing and growing into another thing. His emotions evolved. He let more of that. He found that he needed to blend the two more than he had or more than he had been taught. He was a strongly logical, non-emotional character at the beginning, with his emotions eking through. If you remember, way back at the very beginning, when it was Leonard Nimoy and Jeffrey Hunter playing Spock to Captain Pike, there were even scenes in that where Spock displayed, while being a logical character, that hadn't all been beefed out yet. And he still had emotions. There were places, I remember the scene where they're on the planet's surface and they find that these plants that were there, that were vibrating, were making that whoo sound in the background. And they held them and they stopped doing it. And Spock gives a little wry smile to Pike. Hey, look what that does. So we know that there was emotion there at the beginning. It just evolved into something more strongly logical, eschewing that emotion, to something that it became in the later movies and, of course, then the new incarnations. So we talked of Spock having this flexibility of humanity, flexibility in thinking, the prefrontal cortex as being things that coordinate thought and decide what to do. He had that flexibility of human mind combined with the strength of Vulcan emotion. And he became this child of two worlds. He had this cultural frame switching that, as they call it, a bicultural identity integration that he had to go through. And this is what we saw Spock evolve into. And this character, this is where they psychologically took him. And I think that this was a way that many of the writers, the creators of the show, they took a topic like that and put it into this character for the purpose of these little morality plays, doing that with the characters, showing how these characters act in these situations, how they grow. I think Spock became, along with the whole series, started as an adventure space, wagon train to the stars, Captain Horatio Hornblower in outer space with Captain Kirk, Spock being the emotionless first officer, alien, at least to humans. And they started the series as an adventure show, adventure science fiction. It eventually became this thing that had the morality plays, that showed the psychology of the characters. I'm going to dig into the psychology of Kirk sometime this week, maybe even tomorrow. We'll see how far we get with today. But you see all these different characters represented something about humanity, even though they used Spock, an alien who was half human, to get that message across. And so Spock's primary strategy became numbing himself to his feelings. He did that in the original series to a certain extent, but then when you introduce the J.J. Abrams universe, the loss of his mother, the loss of his whole race, his whole planet. Imagine you're from Earth and your whole race is wiped out and there's maybe 200 of you left. What would that do to you? The loss of your family, mother, the loss of your race. How would that affect you? And they showed how that affected Spock. And we kind of ended yesterday with where Uhura, which was a new element as well, Spock and Uhura in a relationship in the J.J. Abrams universe. She was very disappointed with him that she felt that Spock didn't give a thought to her or anybody. What would happen if he died and left her bereft, was her feeling. She said, you didn't feel anything, you didn't care. And Spock's response, I think, shows where the character was being taken in this newer incarnation of Spock. He said, your suggestion that I don't care about dying is incorrect. A sentient being's optimal chance of maximizing their utility is a long and prosperous life. It's true that I chose not to feel anything upon realizing that my own life was ending. This was the volcano scene. And then he says, as Kirk was dying and into darkness, he says, it's true that I chose not to feel anything upon realizing that my own life was ending. As redacted, he said he was dying. I joined with his consciousness and experienced what he felt at the moment of his passing. Anger, confusion, loneliness, fear. He said, I'd experienced those feelings before, multiplied exponentially on the day my planet was destroyed. And such a feeling is something I chose never to experience again. And he told her, he says, you mistake my choice not to feel as a reflection of my not caring. Well, I assure you the truth is precisely the opposite. And so this is how he justified the way he acted. And this is where I said yesterday that the Spock of the present movies, the J.J. Abrams incarnations, is somebody who is fitting all the major criteria of PTSD. He's re-experiencing trauma and traumatic events. He's avoiding situations. He's becoming very sensitive to certain feelings, knowing what he can and cannot handle. And if you remember, this is how Kirk got him, in a sense, to release his control of the Enterprise, his captaincy, was that he felt that he was no longer emotionally stable to run the Enterprise, to command the Enterprise. And because he had to continually deal with these feelings that he had, in a sense, suppressed. Spock was no longer a Vulcan who didn't have emotions from the original series. He was a Vulcan who had to repress and push down his emotions in order to function on a logical level, and making logic the surrogate for emotion. And so he became an awful lot like soldiers and veterans returning from war with PTSD. But this isn't the man that Spock is, of course, destined to be in the long run. We ended yesterday with mentioning cowboy diplomacy. The Spock of the future, the one played by Leonard Nimoy, isn't emotionally stuck. He's incredibly flexible. And unlike most Vulcans, this Spock rejected Kolinar. He decided to pursue logic and emotions. He integrated both of his cultures. He was switching his perspectives as needed, depending upon the situation he was in. And he understood conflicting points of view, making him highly empathic and open-minded. And, of course, he has all the strength of his Vulcan psychology and his Vulcan physiology that carried him through that. That's why he was so good at negotiating peace between the Klingon Empire and the United Federation of Planets, as well as the Vulcan High Command and the Romulan Empire. So Captain Picard even compared Spock's tactics to cowboy diplomacy. It was an emotional comparison, never made of any other Vulcan. When you think about his unique biology, his bicultural youth, this integral cultural framing he had to go through, the supportive parents he had, it's easy to see how future Spock came to be. And this is the Spock we were used to before the J.J. Abrams universe. Now, and by the way, if you remember Kolinar, that was first introduced to us with Star Trek The Motion Picture, which came out in 1979. Very unauspicious title to that film, by the way. The whole thing with V'ger and all of that. And you saw Spock, when you first encounter him, he's going through the ceremonies and the process of, it was almost like a Jesus 40 days in the wilderness, fasting and praying. This is what he was doing. He was eschewing logic. And then, of course, he got the call from V'ger. He could hear this. And it was attacking his psyche, so to speak. And he had to go pursue this, and he had to give it up. And, of course, when you first saw Spock in that movie, remember, you saw him come on the bridge, and he had on what looked like black tights, these tight black pants, and the kind of poncho, black poncho with the Vulcan symbols on it. And he speaks like this. He is very cold. And this was our first reintroduction to Spock after the 12-year hiatus between the series and the movies. And I thought he was rather cold and harsh, even looked cold and harsh. And all of his vocals were like this, and he was very matter-of-factly, and because he was going through this. But he had an ulterior motive. And then, of course, we see his change when he encounters V'ger. And then remember the scene on the sickbay table later in the movie, where he sits up and he's almost smiling, and he grabs Kirk by the hand, and he's realizing that he needs to integrate the two, that being emotionless was not the way to go. So, what did all of this mean for the Spock of the present, the one who's struggling so deeply with his emotions in the movies, the J.J. Abrams movies? Individuals who experience PTSD can go down many different paths. Now, Zachary Quinto's Spock will never turn out exactly like Leonard Nimoy's Spock, the one who experienced significant trauma and the other one didn't. Spock in the present movies can learn to overcome his trauma and grow from the experience. Older Spock didn't have to do that. So the post-traumatic growth is the positive change that we see psychologically in Spock in the newer incarnations that happens to a person as a result of their struggle with a trauma. And trauma doesn't, by the way, always cause you to grow. Trauma can be the thing that sets you back. Look at people who have had trauma and haven't moved beyond it. They don't grow anywhere. People who have been abused physically, abused sexually when they were young, if they haven't learned to go beyond that, they're stuck there. It is I know so many people, not necessarily personal close friends, but people who are in these situations in their childhood who have never grown beyond those things. Trauma doesn't make you grow. It's all about the decisions that you make as a result of trauma that brings growth. And many people who experience post-traumatic growth describe the feeling it was changed by their traumatic experiences, feel more connected to others. And they become more resilient against crisis, or they have a greater appreciation for life. Think of Captain Picard in Tapestry, that episode. Growth doesn't make people stop suffering. Pain is a part of the process. Growth can't happen until you know how to face difficult emotions and talk about and work through the things going on in your head that have brought you to that. I remember with Captain Kirk. Do you remember, I put up this quote yesterday because it actually coincidentally came up in my memories on my Facebook page as something I had posted back in 2014. It was from The Final Frontier, and my favorite line from The Final Frontier of Kirk's, one that stuck with me anyway, other than, excuse me, what does God need with a starship? That was a great line, a memorable line. But I think the most memorable about Kirk and about his psychological makeup was where he said, "You know that pain and guilt can't be taken away with the wave of a magic wand. They're the things we carry with us, the things that make us who we are. If we lose them, we lose ourselves. I don't want my pain taken away. I need my pain, Kirk said. And so when you see this about Kirk, you know that this is a man. Remember, he went on to say, he says, why should I always question that I turned left when I should have turned right? He said, I've made my mistakes and I grow by them. So growth happens as a result of mistakes, as a result of tragedy, as a result of trauma. And this is the challenge for present Spock, is to overcome his emotional demons. Now, you've seen the movies, I'm sure, Into Darkness. I'm sure you've seen that. The kind of reworking of the Wrath of Khan story, where everything flip-flops in that story. We already begin to see signs of growth in Spock. And a lot of it has to do with his friendship with Kirk. This was something I was hoping they would not bypass or ruin, is how that friendship began and how strong they became together. This was a new source of resiliency for Spock, was this friendship with Kirk. And if you remember, I remember, this is Amok Time in the original series. It was one of my favorite episodes. And the reason it was because of this bond between Kirk and Spock. And when he learned, because of a result of Pon farr and the whole summer, that he thought he had killed Kirk, he was going to turn himself in. And at the end of the show, you see Kirk walk out and say, well, wouldn't you have to consult with me first? And Kirk kind of gives the wry smile and walks on. And Spock says, Jim? Our captain, and he grabs him by the arm and he turns around and smiling. He says, Jim! Because he realized he hasn't killed his closest friend. Kirk is that resiliency for Spock. He is the thing that helped Spock grow out of this conflict that he had, this cultural conflict. And so why is Spock such an enduring character? It's precisely because he is a reflection of who we are. We as people, we as humans, each of us has had one time or another where we feel that we felt different, strange, out of place. As a child, Spock didn't completely fit in among Vulcans or humans. Yet he goes on to become the most influential character and officer in Starfleet. And he was an amazing character. He wasn't a flawed person. Yet he felt a little bit of that because of the half-breed situation. So growing up as a bicultural child, he learned that he could hope for something better, that he could become something better, and he did, despite the culture clash. So the current Spock honors our experiences of living in a world where we constantly are exposed to traumatic events, cultural events, and most of us haven't been impacted by terrorism or terrorist attacks, thank God. But we know some people who have. We know it's happened in our country. But you can respond to those events by avoiding feelings sometimes. Watching Spock struggle with the loss of his mother in a similar way makes us all feel a little less crazy. So Spock's future reminds us that our differences are our strengths. I've never been a big one that says diversity is our strength. I think unity is our strength. But we bring our diverse makeups to it. And that's the ultimate lesson from the psychology of Spock. If we can find ways to embrace all aspects of ourselves and approach life with an open mind, we're capable of great accomplishments and things. That's the psychology of Spock. Now, let's get into a little bit more of the psychology of Star Trek itself. We'll do that after the break. Got to go out for 2 minutes. Sit right there. We'll be right back. All right, folks, welcome back from that break. I appreciate your sitting there and waiting for the show to start again. I'm Scotty Roberts, and this is my show, the Intrepid Radio Program, where we cover things like history, archaeology, weird events, weird history, world origins, things like that. All that kind of weird stuff. Ghosts, the paranormal things. Today and the last day we've been talking about Star Trek. And another one of my great loves in life. And so we're going to continue on with the psychology of Star Trek, right on the heels of the psychology of Spock. And by the way, you're listening right here on the Odyssey One Radio Network, or Odyssey Radio Network. Odyssey One is the website, ODYSY1.com. And you can view the video of this episode simulcast on my YouTube, youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. So come on over and join us. You can join the live chat room and talk about this episode as we're talking about it on air. So let's get into a little more of the psychology of Trek itself. Now, first of all, I got to tell you, as most of you already know, I'm a Trekkie. I'm not a Trekker. I'm a Trekkie. I grew up in the late 60s and all through the 70s, and this is where I got my exposure to Trek, and that's the kind of Trek fan I am. And I've been Trek the whole time. William Shatner. Let's amend that. Captain Kirk was my hero when I was growing up as a little kid, and that morphed into my appreciation for William Shatner. And, of course, appreciation for the show the older I got, and got out of the lore of Star Trek. I got into the making of Star Trek and the stuff behind it. And that's what drives this episode tonight and last night's episode, and maybe more episodes we'll have this week, is digging into and examining this whole psychology of Trek. The stuff behind it that was put together. Initially, it was an action-adventure series, but it incorporated these things into it, and it has become a reflection of who we are, as we just discussed with Spock. And so I want to look at Star Trek, the mental frontier. Can Kirk and Spock teach us psychology as no one's ever taught it before? Teaching psychology where no man has gone before. So Star Trek, through a dozen motion pictures, more than 700 episodes over the course of 6 live-action television series, not to mention the animated series, and endless streams of novels, comic books, fan fiction. Star Trek characters have explored strange new worlds and the range of human nature itself, because creator Gene Roddenberry believed in showing the essential humanity of all sentient species, regardless of their planet of origin. Their extraterrestrial non-humans also let us look at real psychological processes. And while Star Trek explores many aspects of human nature, key issues keep reappearing, particularly those of importance to understanding and resolving conflicts between diverse peoples, emotional conflicts, conflicts with self, and even the ongoing struggle between logic and emotion, which we just talked about with Spock, manifests as a cultural issue. So I think that there are several things that we can look at in Star Trek that really give us the basis for learning psychology from Trek. Now, don't be disillusioned. You know, we hear all this stuff about Gene Roddenberry, and he was, granted, a great man. And to Star Trek fans, he's almost a demigod, because he created this series. He created these characters. He had all these things he wanted to accomplish with it, to show diversity, to show blending of cultures, to show the psychology, the morality plays, all of these things. But he was also a writer in Hollywood looking to make a buck. So make no mistake, you can do those things together. Maybe that's part of a psychological exercise in itself. How can you make a show that's a good show that has all these qualities and still really be there to want to make a living off of it? Nothing wrong with that. So, and he had his fights with studios. He had his fights with all the producers. He had all of his fights along the way to try to make this thing happen. And there were times he lost touch with its message as well. And that's for another discussion altogether. Let's look at what he did create. Let's look at some of these psychological factors that you find in Star Trek. We just talked about Spock. So logic versus emotion. Each Star Trek series cast includes a main character who seeks to understand human emotion. Did you notice that? You probably did if you're a fan of Star Trek. But look at each one of the series, each one of the movies. They always had a character. Spock, in the original series, was the Vulcan-human hybrid. And he was known to fans in the original series as the Vulcan who was half human, and always struggling with that. Data, the android in Star Trek The Next Generation. Odo, the shapeshifter in Deep Space Nine. Tuvok, the Vulcan in the Voyager's holographic doctor in the Voyager series. And yet another Vulcan, T'Pol, hot I might add, female for once, in Star Trek Enterprise. And while the Vulcans suppress strong emotions beneath the veneer of logic, emotionless Data seems to become more human, and Odo, capable of mimicking human beings, dispassionately observes human nature with curiosity and rarely with envy. So you had this emotion thing going on, this emotion versus logic thing. And you see this, I remember when The Next Generation first came out in 1988, much anticipated by Star Trek fans. And we were comparing all the characters. Well, if Picard is the Kirk character, no, he'd be more the... You got Riker would be the Kirk character because he's the womanizer. You'd have Data be the Spock character because of the android system and the trying to become human. So who is Picard exactly? And so on. We did all of that analysis. We found out they were characters all in their own right. But they still had the character that was seeking logic versus, or emotion versus logic. How to become human. There was fantasy versus reality. Characters often had to make choices between accepting reality or retreating into fantasy, whether through worlds filled with illusion, like the Menagerie or the Cage, the original Star Trek premiere with Jeffrey Hunter as Captain Pike. Shore Leave in the original series. Many holodeck adventures in The Next Generation, or Voyager's recurring holodeck village, something they stored in the holodeck files. You had pro-social versus anti-social psychological elements of Star Trek. Distinguishing good from evil can be really tricky sometimes. In The Enemy Within, an original episode from the original series, where a transporter malfunction divides Kirk into two people, the good Kirk and the bad Kirk. And you know, I often wondered, you think about that, it's obvious science fiction, but you think about that, how could a malfunction in a transporter decide which part is good and which part is evil? But what we found out about that transporter accident, after splitting Kirk in two, one embodies his aggressive nature, and the other is non-aggressive nature. Aggressive Kirk is not purely evil, nor is the non-aggressive Kirk an effective leader. Both sides can merge back into a single individual for Captain Kirk to use all his strengths, if you remember, when they're going to merge them back together. And they hope this is going to work. The evil Kirk, almost in tears and despair, is like, "I want to live!" he yells out, because he thinks he's going to lose his life. The good Kirk lost some of his command ability because that quote-unquote evil side of him was something that gave him the power, the authority, that basis for being strong. And not that goodness can't make you strong, but he became gentle as opposed to the aggression he needed to combine with the gentleness to become something. This was exploring our two different natures and how they conflict with each other sometimes. Sometimes we can be very one way in our life, but need the other way, the good and the bad, the dark and the light. And you can't have them separated from each other, or you'll make bad decisions. They all have to be put together and integrated. In the original series episode, The Conscience of the King, that shows that good intentions can produce actions that history could deem monstrous. And I don't remember the character's name off the top of my head. You probably know. But the character who is the actor, the Shakespearean actor in that aboard the Enterprise that they're transporting, he is recognized as being the Hitler-like, Stalin-like totalitarian leader of a world that when he was overthrown went into hiding, just disappeared, and now he's re-emerged. Nobody knows who he is. He's this famous actor, and he's found to be this guy. And that those deeds that were deemed monsters and monstrous might nevertheless possess the capacity for remorse. Lack of remorse and empathy largely define psychopathy, essentially evil disorder. There's greater cruelty and sadism are core aspects of malignant narcissism, a more severe personality pathology that psychologist Erich Fromm called the quintessence of evil. Now, Roddenberry eventually regretted that he overemphasized the Klingons and their worst qualities, but he made them seem so utterly evil because he did not believe an entire race or a culture could be evil and only evil, and so he regretted having originally made them that way. And with so many Star Trek villains, anyone interested in using Star Trek to look at psychology and how psychology works would have no shortage of examples to draw from while discussing the complexities of pro-social and antisocial actions and intentions. The Klingons had a goal. They were like the Mongol hordes, is who they were supposed to resemble in the original series. And you find, though, that Klingons also had a different side. Were we surprised in the series, the Next Generation especially brought this out, that there were Klingon philosophers and Klingon poets and Klingon explorers and scientists, as opposed to just Klingon conquerors? This is what their race was, what they did. They were aggressive. But we saw them painted down. And do you notice, the more you get to know something or someone that is usually painted very dark or evil, the more of the goodness you can see, or some of the things that are underneath. Same with good people. The more you see good people, the more you can find that when you learn of something they did that was heinous in your way of thinking, it disillusions you a bit because you realize this good person is also capable of bad things. You look at somebody like a Martin Luther King Jr., very good man who stood for very good things. But the more you learn about his private affairs, and by affairs I mean that literally, his abuses of women and things like that, the more you say, wow. And I held him up as such a high individual, a highly good individual. You learn the bad things. You've got to learn psychologically to be able to integrate these things with our heroes and our demons. Star Trek accomplished this. It's a psychological thing. Conflict versus peacekeeping. Enterprise captains who preach peaceful conflict resolution get into a hell of a lot of fights in the series. Have you noticed that? Sometimes it takes a little war to bring peace, even on microcosmic scales. And so you would have these captains could sometimes, Kirk, the flying drop kick, many times that won the hearts of some of the people he needed to. And so a lot of fights came out of trying to preach peaceful conflict resolution. Relevant issues included pacifism, subordinate goals, critical to like Voyager's series premise, mirror image perceptions, the errand of mercy, Day of the Dove. Those two original Star Trek episodes perfectly showed this whole conflict and peacekeeping issue at conflict and then having to bring them together. There was a security versus freedom issue with Star Trek. Psychologist Erich Fromm held that the basic human dilemma involves contradictory desires for both freedom and security. And Star Trek emphasizes freedom to the point of destructing restrictive security. Time and again, Kirk breaks the Prime Directive. This is what he was known for. He was rogue. He was, a maverick, and he'd get in trouble, but then always redeem himself because he accomplished the goal. Starfleet's non-interference policy was something that Kirk was pretty much non-interested in unless he absolutely had to. And then many times he just broke through that anyway, in order to help her to make people shake off what he saw in the experience he was in as tyranny. So Kirk's distrust of utopian societies colors his view on both pacifism and security. Again, he could be the guy that could bring a good punch to the jaw while trying to convince you to a peaceful negotiation, because he saw that necessity. Human dilemma involves contradictory desires. Remember, even Ben Franklin said, if you sacrifice, If you sacrifice liberty for a bit of security, you'll find that you'll have neither. So this is a conflict that was shown in the psychology of Star Trek. The whole us versus them issue. Hundreds of Star Trek episodes address how different groups view each other. Do you remember in The Undiscovered Country with the Klingon ambassador who was murdered, and his daughter says something, the Federation, the humans only club, she called it, with much disdain. And she said, you see everybody who is not human as being subordinate to you. There were issues of prejudice and discrimination, stereotypes, outgroup homogeneity, and related attitudes. And ironically, although Star Trek often perpetuates this kind of thinking by presenting vastly more diversity among humans than with any alien extraterrestrial species. The extraterrestrials were pretty pure. They didn't have a lot of differences. Humans had all these differences, spread from good to bad to gentle to evil, even evil. And so they started trying to show this in the aliens and the adversaries as well. Even a race like the Klingons, who were aggressive and meant to be the evil axis to the Federation's allies. And yet we started seeing them exposed for being more multidimensional than just evil. Another thing in Star Trek is the scientific method. Star Trek features many scientific characters, obviously. Even more so in The Next Generation than in the original series. The original series was based on action. The Next Generation had plenty of action, but also focused on science, on the growing of the human condition. And their research projects, their discussions of scientific ethics, as in the Voyager episode Scientific Method. You might have difficulty linking most of the featured science to psychological research methods, because they didn't always use that. But this showed us that there was scientific methodology in Star Trek, which was really a petri dish for seeing all of this psychological interaction with the characters. Psychophysiology, from the ridiculous original series third season premiere, Spock's Brain, broadly hailed as probably one of the worst original series episodes. Although the concept wasn't all that bad, I think it was merely the lack of budget to do anything more grandiose than the way they did it, or to make it work in a better way. We kind of saw things like this in the movies like Lawnmower Man, or things where, or what was the one where Johnny Depp puts his persona into a computer program? Things like that. Spock's Brain was basically that without all those other trappings. So it was kind of a ridiculous episode, though. But in Voyager, there was an episode in which the aliens provoked prisoners They provoke their aggression with stimulus to the brain's hypothalamus. The Shoot was the episode for that. Star Trek's plot frequently relied on tampering with characters' brains, their nervous systems, their neurotransmitters. How many times did I never heard the word neurotransmitter until Star Trek. Their hormones, sometimes affecting everybody on the ship except for whichever one single character saves the day for everybody else. I remember, why wasn't he affected? I remember that in the original series episode, This Side of Paradise. Everybody was affected except Kirk. He's alone on the ship, and then in a moment of weakness, he gets sprayed with the spores, and it changes him. But he quickly works his way out of that. There's this whole sensation and perception part of Star Trek. Physical senses. The ones examined the most in Star Trek is vision, particularly its loss when Spock briefly goes blind, Operation Annihilate. Star Trek The Next Generation has a blind main character, Geordi LaForge. Loud as a Whisper in The Next Generation featured a deaf negotiator, and many deaf actors appear in walk-on roles. Members of the Ferengi race have greater hearing than do other characters. Oh, and by the way, going back to this whole psychophysiology, this whole idea of messing with the brain, do you remember the episode with Picard in Chain of Command, where there is a, not Gul Dukat, who is it? What's the race? I'm slipping on the name of the race. You'll know it. The Cardassians. Picard is taken prisoner, and he's being tortured. And this torture wasn't always physical, it was mental. Remember, there are 4 lights! That episode. And so we have all of these types of psychology that are being dealt with in Star Trek and brought out. You know, it was Picard. It was Patrick Stewart. If you remember my story from having met him, he produced a play called Every Good Boy Deserves Favor on torture and third world dissidency and things like that. I think in part as a result of that episode. And he toured that play around. Generations, the developmental issues. Star Trek offers outstanding opportunities for reviewing developmental psychology. See it with Spock in the first part of this show. Even though the Enterprise of the original series didn't feature Starfleet crew traveling with their families, as in The Next Generation, the program often looked at developmental issues, childhood. Look at the episode In the Children Shall Lead. Adolescence, one of what I thought was one of the best earliest episodes of Star Trek, Charlie X. This kid who'd been raised by extraterrestrials, and he's finally coming home, but we find all his flaws coming up because he's immature. And you remember that last very sad, almost pathetic scene on the bridge. Pathetic is maybe the wrong word. Emotive, ethotic scene where the extraterrestrials are going to take him back. He obviously can't handle being with his own kind. He'll destroy you. And he's pleading with Kirk and Janice Rand and everybody on the bridge, don't let them take me. And then as he's fading, his voice echoes off saying, I want to stay, stay, stay. And he vanishes. So they dealt with his adolescence. Immaturity in the Squire of Gothos. Do you remember him? Oh, you wonder later on if he's supposed to be a Q. Did Q come from this? You part of the Q continuum? The Squire of Gothos? They dealt with parenthood in Friday's Child. If you remember her, Julie Newmar, Catwoman, meow. She played the wife of one of the natives of this planet who was pregnant. And you remember McCoy touched her belly because she was very pregnant, and she slaps him. And he looks at her and scowls, and he touches the stomach again. She slaps him, and he slaps her back. And he says, Madam, I am a doctor, and I will touch you in any way that I see fit. So, parenthood, pregnancy, sex was dealt with in Star Trek. And I'm not talking about just Kirk and, what was the old Eddie Murphy joke? He says, Captain Kirk, here, space hole. He says, he effed that green bitch. You remember? Kirk, that's not the sex we're talking about. Sex, amok time, where Spock goes into the Pon farr and we learn of Pon farr. The Mark of Gideon. All our yesterdays. All have to do with these things. Gender in Wolf in the Fold. Elaine of Troyes. Turnabout Intruder, which is another episode I don't really like, but Kirk played a woman of the 60s, by the way. Marriage in For the World is Hollow and I Have Touched the Sky. Aging in The Omega Glory. One of my favorite episodes of Star Trek. Senility in The Deadly Years, where they all start aging. Dying in For the World is Hollow and I Have Touched the Sky. Grief in The Man Trap, one of the earliest episodes of Star Trek. Immortality in Metamorphosis and Requiem for Methuselah. Rewatch some of those episodes. So, all this stuff about Star Trek has all these psychological factors. There's a bunch more. There is, I've got here, motivation, altered states, memory, language and psycholinguistics, personality, artificial intelligence, AI, psychopathology, psychotherapy, social pathology, optimism. All of these things are psychological matters that are dealt with in Star Trek, but we're out of time tonight. We'll pick this up again tomorrow night and hopefully get into start psychoanalyzing Kirk a little bit, my favorite character. Folks, thanks for listening. We got to go out for a 23-hour break, but we'll be back. Stay tuned. See you tomorrow.